Dr. Marivate is based at the University of Pretoria as the UP APSA Chair of Data Science. He works on developing machine learning and artificial intelligence methods to extract insights from data. And a large part of his work over the past several years, and something that I've learned a lot from, is at the intersection of machine learning and natural language processing as it applies to various domains, including health and the environment and many other aspects, and also on the low resource language tools. And as part of this, he's created new software libraries, new research approaches to robust natural language processing, and encouraging the development of data sets in African languages. It's really a pleasure for me to introduce you all to Dr. Marivate and for us to get an opportunity to learn from him. I'm really glad that we were able to get on your calendar. Vukosi has co-founded one of the most influential initiatives in the sort of global South data ecosystem called Deep Learning Indaba. I think for many of us, it's an intimately familiar initiative. For those who don't know, I highly recommend that you check it out. It's the largest machine learning and AI workshop within the African continent, and it aims to strengthen the African machine learning community. So with that, I will hand it over to Vukosi, and really excited to learn from you today.
Okay, thanks. And I'm really happy to be here. As it's been a while to interact with people in this way, even though we are in this weird pandemic time. We'll speak hopefully for the 35 minutes or so, and I'll really be happy to have a discussion. Even though there's some live streaming that's happening, it's okay. Probably I will allow even those crazy questions, and I will try to answer as many of them as possible. So today's talk, and also thanks everybody who's on the Zoom call, seeing also some familiar faces I haven't seen in a very long time as well. The talk today, I thought it was a coming to grips with the reality of data science, and yes, it's people all the way down, meaning it doesn't matter really where you start, you end up having to deal with people issues. And this is something that's really very close to my heart in thinking about this, in that there's one part of doing data science or doing machine learning, and within the academy, what tends to be, we work on algorithms, you write the paper, but when you really want to have something be out there, not necessarily just in production, that it's a system that people have access to, but that people can actually have a net benefit, it takes a little bit more on that part. And I was really inspired by this series of seminars that are going on this, and seeing also the past speakers on there. So first I'll give some view, just to give a view of our group. So Radiette has already said a bit about myself, that I come from this small township, not far, like an hour from where I live right now, in Pretoria, called Harangua. I was born there, went to Wits University for my undergrad and also my master's, and that's where I started on my AI journey. Ended up at Rutgers doing my PhD in reinforcement learning, and even then I got really interested in how you make things practical for other people to use, as opposed to just the algorithm. That's the thing that really woke me up in the morning. In between there, interned at this company called Meebo, was acquired by Google, so I interned there. Work at Newton, which is an edtech startup, which has changed a lot now, but working on data science there. Went to this thing called the CSIR, which is the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, almost like the national labs in the US, but really on, again, building tools out there. Co-founded Deep Learning Indaba, and now I'm at the University of Pretoria, and then I lead this data science for social impact research group. So to give more of that context, especially of the CSIR for this talk, really there was this big, coming back to South Africa and the CSIR in 2015. Hey, I really want to do data science, but then we want to do it for the social good thing. So we started really a small team inside the CSR looking at this, and then there's a paper there that Nyaling and myself, Nyaling was my colleague at the time, and now she's at Google AI, thinking about these things. So like what actually happens when you try to do them. So that's the kind of the first paper, just looking at what we were able to try, what worked, and how you needed to get data right on this part. working a lot with government to harness data for decision making, with all that comes with that, and then training future data scientists, whether through DSide or the deep learning endeavor, on that part. So then in 2018, I moved to the University of Pretoria, and there I have this research group, Data Science for Social Impact, still doing research and teaching within these spaces, especially in these intersections, data science and natural language processing. And then there's this COVID-19 happened, also then thinking about, okay, now if you want to really make an impact here, what actually would you need, what would we need to do? And we started working on this COVID-19 ZA project, I think a week after the first case in South Africa, and then it's still going. And I still have to, in the mornings, update some of the data and check, and then get hate emails sometimes because something broke somewhere that people need. But it's all part of this part. So the group is made up of, again, young people, senior members, junior members, students, and also faculty or staff at the university working in these spaces. As I said, because it's in these intersections, about 60% of the work we do is natural language processing, really. And then there's this data science for society issue. So an example here, we just finished this really. This year finally got published on looking at digital forensics to identify kind of factors in behavior for sexual predators online. This is kind of like now the old world of the internet, because where you could have access to chat, or chat was before encryption. So there were actually parts of data sets that were created, but then can you actually identify, given psychological factors, what actually is going on within these chats when you might have a sexual predator, and then can you identify that early? So that was some work that happened like 2 years back, and we've just been trying to finish that off. We've done work on modeling in social media. This one was about a year ago or 2 years ago, again, on the South African elections. There's a little bit now on COVID. I think there's 2 or 3 projects that are going on. But then how do we actually extract that information? As per the introduction, I work a lot on African natural language processing at the moment. So just 2 projects to highlight here. One is can we create data sets? What does it actually take to make sure that you can curate them correctly, collate them, make them ready for other people to use, and then especially come up with that initial task that people then can build on. It is really a lot of layers of challenges to get to this point. Just for as an example, it's been about 5 years of me trying to get the national broadcaster in South Africa to avail their data. I've seen it, they've shown it to me. It's just getting it is a whole different ball game on this part, and for different reasons on that part. Another project that's very close to my heart is the Masakane project, which started off initially as doing natural language translation for African languages, but now has spun off. It's its own thing. I can't even really make it to see the whole thing. But we started this initially to have a distributed research project. So it's still going now. There's other tasks. There's name data recognition, people doing things like speech. All those things are now happening inside there. It's really a great project in terms of finding alternative ways to do research, and that still gets a lot of participation from a broad range of society on that part. Stray observations, prior speaker spotlight being Tina, who spoke here. I took a graph mining seminar from Prof. Alessia Raj. Wow, I don't even remember, probably 2011 or something like that. It really expanded my horizons greatly. I come from reinforcement learning initially, and I took this class and I was doing graph mining for like a semester. I was like, this is very interesting, but I'm already doing a PhD in this other stuff, kind of in any way. So Tina was also on my PhD committee and really influenced my move from RL to DS. So once I finished my PhD, I initially promised myself that I would do a year trying out this data science thing, and I've never really gone back to the reinforcement learning. So that was like 6 years ago. Anyway, and then that's how I get to here being in front of all of you on this part. So these are like just connections, like of things that sometimes look inconsequential, but then in the latter, things really do have knock-on effects on there. So yeah, today I wanted to talk about in this, what happens when you are a data science practitioner in reality. So I'm not going to if I'm talking about natural language processing, we can go with technicalities. If I'm talking about anomaly detection, I can go into all these things, GANs. There's all this work that we do, but today let's actually look at this issues of what happens when you promise things and what happens in between. So typically when I'm teaching, I tend to talk about this data science pipeline, where you go from data acquisition, you process, integrate, you model, you validate, and then you do some presentation or you deploy, right? And then hopefully that's where you think that your impact is going to come, right? This thing is out there, people are using it, or it's being used in decision making, and as such, you're seeing this social kind of impact on that part. So if we first look at that part, so thought one, sorry, I don't have the reference for this, I should really find it. So there's this issue that we've had to come to terms with, especially over maybe the last 3 years or so, right? Or even longer, just in technology in general, being very much tech optimistic. Now you can be AI optimistic, data science optimistic. So enthusiasts really believe that the technologies will give us all this better evidence to inform policy, right? But improving the evidence, right? That one part is just one part of the job on that part. But we live in this time where people really want easy answers to very difficult questions. And this is what happens a lot if you're really doing data science and you're really working with people, stakeholders. What you'll find is that sometimes you get brought in because people think, oh, you're the AI person and you can solve this. You take that, put this, and then boom, you've got a solution on there. Oh, there's going to it's going to be easy. It's going to be done in a week. It's going to be done in a month on this part. So this is something to to really have in the back of your mind in these interactions about how they can be so misconstrued and they can actually lead to really bad kind of places to start off with, right? And this is if we see everything as just a technical problem, we're going to have big problems later, kind of on. This is from Nigeria, who's she was a Mozilla fellow, if I remember correctly. And one is another thing that if you do research in this space, especially for me, I came from government and research as well as academia. So then you kind of get to this part of having to understand that private sector thinking, right? And a lot of time practice influences the public sector's tech competence and capacity. So in some parts, for whatever, good or bad, we have to come to terms sometimes that if you're here to sell a technology, it's always going to be the solution to the problem that the other person has, right? It doesn't matter what really kind of it is, but then at the same time, do you really want people to have the competence or capacity to absorb that technology, or you want them to really be slightly under, right? That they don't have capacity so that they can always hire you to bring out that solution. And these are just interactions that you now, or incentives that are in the system, right? And at the same time is to then think about public sector as a hack. All we need is to get a few good people in a room with the right technologies, and over a weekend or over a week, they'll come up with something that's useful within this. And AI in some spaces has just been making this a little bit more scary, because people don't think, they just think the machines are going to think for us. And then because it's even more magic than saying it's a program on that part. And again, just because I've sat in these rooms, and there's these parts and then of saying what's machine learning and AI. On this part, there's that now, yes, most of the time we're working on these machine learning algorithms, but then there's PowerPoint. Then PowerPoint comes in, and you have to deal with this as a researcher when you come in later and you're trying to interact with people, and they've seen the shiny PowerPoints, and then now it's also putting expectations on you. But it's important as we're doing this in practice to understand the differences between technical and adaptive challenges. And I point to a nice article by a Survival Guide for Leaders on this part, because there's things, yes, that we can solve technically, and we know how to do that very well, but there's sometimes adaptive challenges where now you're looking at changing behavior around specific things. And these are harder because you have to think about people. Right? It's not simply about the technical thing in front of you. You're not just thinking about the computer vision problem that you're trying to solve on there, right? as researchers, we love to solve these technical problems. We go into great lengths to do that, come up with new algorithms, come up with new ways of thinking on this part. But people are also the challenge and the solution to a lot of things out there. And most of the time with most of the projects I think we work on, whether you notice it or not, you're working on problems that actually go back and forth between us, right? It is not just simply whether you first discover it because you're trying to get access to some data, and then you reach a people problem in trying to get that data, right? Because then there's issues about getting that. Or later on, when you try to deploy, and then you identify that actually the thing that you thought was going to be a solution actually is being misread, or people don't understand it as well as you thought that they actually do. Again, more recent work here, and in terms of writing, what data can do, right? Which is in the New Yorker, and really talks about like what happens in this. We're now like, I'm one of those people who said, hey, I want our decision makers to be more data driven. But what happens now when you start putting in data and that data then is used for measurement, and if it's used for measurement, it then becomes something that people can gain, right? And I think especially here, the audience in mechanism design, you should know a little bit more of this. So, once you start putting out numbers and then those numbers become part of a scoreboard, they change the way people behave, whether intended or not, kind of intended. And this is where, like, people have to be careful about going beyond as you're doing your data science on this part of now offering very nice numbers that then people then decide that they're going to convert into numbers that are that are measured, and then because they're becoming measured, that's the way that you connect them to incentives, and then those incentives then change the numbers themselves on that, right? So it brings us back maybe a little bit more to that thing of be careful of simple solutions to very complex problems as you're building on other things, right? You will be asked for this. If you're working in these spaces and you're having to interact, people will ask for these simple solutions for very complex problems, solutions in the box. And then from there, these things then get tied to incentives. So one example of this is going through this recent paper that came out on this pitfalls of machine learning used in COVID-19, especially looking at CT scans and radiographs, right? That there were over 300 AI models that were created, and given that study, over 2,000 studies for COVID medical imaging. I think there were like 6 or 60 that they found might be actually part of this review, and they just found that none of them actually were useful, right? Because they had fundamental flaws inside these things, and some of this I think was there was a lot of incentives to get on one part. Like I will say, maybe as a personal reflection here, there was a lot of at the beginning of COVID, what can I do? Right? It doesn't matter which field you're in. You are figuring out, we're about to go through one of the human race's biggest challenges ever. And wherever I am, what is it that I could be doing to actually assist? So that's one part of it. You don't want to just be sitting at home watching the world burn, But then on the other side, there was also all these incentives of saying, oh, I can use AI. People have this infatuation with it. Let me throw some data with AI, and then we can solve parts of this COVID thing. And this was it was so, for me personally, it felt like, oh, it is so easy. Let's just, maybe we should think about this. And I had to, at the beginning of this, I will talk about the story a little bit about our COVID journey, was to stop ourselves on with my research group, say, no, we're not doing modeling at all. There are people who do epidemiology, who work on models like this every damn day. They know how to do this. We should just get them what they need, right? As quickly as possible, as opposed to thinking hey, I've been doing time series LSTMs for anomaly detection. Now I can use it to better predict where, that. It's yeah, I can try to solve this technique, but I don't know who's going to need this, right? That's another part of this thing. But at the same time, you then had this kind of mix and concoction, and maybe it's being in South Africa, which UK as a developing country, that people were looking at funding agencies, and funding agencies were more likely to give you funding if you had AI or machine learning or data science in your proposal, these instant, instant grants that showed up last year, kind of in a way. So this kind of now prepared, as I said, like it becomes, oh yeah, I should tack on AI on my project on this part. And at the same time, one of the other things I noticed is also using AI or data science as something that you add on to add complexity to your solution, so that either government or other private sector partners might say, oh yeah, we'll fund this, right? So one of this was seeing a couple of projects, so I'm not going to name anybody really, on, hey, let's do facial recognition for track and trace. And you're like, why? How is this how is this useful in a way? And maybe sure, it might be I have experience being in having worked with the public sector, because like, oh, I can see this from like a very high up manager thinking, oh, this is complicated, which means it should be good. But from a practical point of view, at the bottom where it has to actually be rolled out, it was like, I don't see how this is going to help us to do track and trace for COVID. And now having facial recognition, it doesn't really solve, but it does look like, adding complexity to your project increases the budget and all those things. And there was a lot of that on that. The other part, we've talked about that deploy, and there might be issues that come with that and incentives. The other one is that in this data acquisition. So here it's just on the thing of where do we get our data. On this part, I am going to use a more example that everybody knows, but I can also connect it to COVID again. So, right, and another, I like to sometimes being on Twitter, using tweets also has nice little thought bubbles on there, right? That sometimes you get to, we had this issue that the people closest, most times, the people who are the most close to a technology become evangelists and they try to get it out there. But with machine learning and AI, sometimes people who don't know much about it are the ones who are evangelizing for us. And this then also, again, the expectations become so high, but then really the realities are very different, right? And then it comes down to this, hey, AI is going to take over the world, or the singularity is going to be here. But really, the things that we know are happening, a lot of the times, the simple mistakes are still happening within kind of our systems. In South Africa, I take this being, we're in a country that is known for high crime and all those things. And again, it's easy to think, hey, we can solve things. So the city of Joburg a few years back said, hey, we're going to put up these CCTV cameras and they will now have face recognition on them, and they'll be able to detect thug behavior, right? On this part. And this is and then the system will dispatch officers wherever on this part. And there was a very nice person who asked, what is thug behavior according to your definition, actually? And these important questions that the public really should know about before you're saying you're rolling out a systems. What are the chances of false positive, right? Is there any human intervention? How secure is the system? And should we be concerned about our own privacy and data in this space? And we live in, because we have safety and security issues in the country, it's more and more that as you're driving around, you see more and more cameras being out there, and then people are selling and say, hey, we're putting in this machine learning in there, it's identifying things. And but really, hey, most of these are commercial systems. They're not really developed even for here on this part. It's more building blocks, take from there, put it out there. And then this is where the infamous experiment from 2 years ago comes in. I was giving another talk at the African Academy of Sciences, and they had invited me, and I decided to take the photo at the top there from there, and then say, hey, let me actually put that through the Imagenet classifier. And there, so this is partly, there's come some of the people at the top of the African Academy of Sciences are in the picture there, and then ran it through the classifier. And yes, that's kind of the things that it identified, which is odd. This is not not staged. I didn't go and specifically pick. I just took their picture and then put it through in that space. And then I use this again to go in and say, yeah, can we explain why? And in terms of thoughts of why we also have a responsibility as scientists to explain, not just to the decision makers who are supposed to ask the right questions when they're procuring the systems, but then also the public, how these systems work. and why they can actually fail, right? And sometimes in very disastrous ways. In this, right? And this was an experiment called Imagenet Roulette. I think it's you can go check it out. I think most people now should really either have heard about why it was put together because of where the data came from. But from South Africa's point of view, was this thing: smart CCTVs in South Africa were becoming a much bigger thing, right? On this part, this is just an example of the pamphlet to advertise one of these systems, and on there, it's like, hey, we can see people, they're walking around. And we have this view, as I said, South Africa has a safe, public safety challenge. I'm not discounting that at all. But then there's also this part that as a Black male, I know if walking around some neighborhoods, even though I have the right to, because it's a public area, I might be accosted or stopped by someone, not even the police, just asking what I'm doing there. Right. And these, obviously, you can see how they can escalate to very, very unwanted things on this part. And there's with knowing the limitations of these systems, how, what will be leading kind of up to. So we've looked now kind of it's an example of the data side of things instead of the output side of building our AI. And even with COVID, this was some of the challenges at the beginning. We had a lot of big push to, hey, let's create these global data sets for COVID. And at the same time, they look very nice, they're big. I think we had, there's a paper that just came out recently in natural language processing about this, people creating very large data sets that cover so much. But then when you look at individual slices, I start identifying that the quality is not that much. And initially with COVID-19, we also had this issue with having that the initial data you would find about South Africa wasn't actually correct. People were just putting it into public databases, even if the newspaper says they interviewed some family and that family said they think their child has COVID, and there will be a number. And then hey, add another number to the count for this country. And as such, again, there was an engineering feat, a technical feat to get this to work correctly. And there was another one to actually get them to actually be as accurate kind of as possible. So for us, we worked on this COVID-19 ZA project. We started it. And this is how can we have as much data about COVID in South Africa in one place, make sure we can collate it, verify it, and reduce some of the chance of error, and also prepare a foundation for other researchers. As I said, we made the conscious choice that we're not going to do any modeling at that time. We found that what it was, there were people who needed this information in a good place to be able to do the work that they wanted to do. And we also wanted to make it open, right? That anybody can connect to the data and use it without restrictions. The challenge being is that I have been in the specific, being in the public sector, I've been in research in industrial research for government, I've been in the academy as well. There's sometimes these red tape that gets added to these things. So we started this project at the beginning, just saying we're going to do this open so that people can contribute. We'll have rules about what has to be put in whichever way, but then also it's open for people to use without any restrictions. On there. So it was kind of a very simple data mining process to figure out where the data is coming only from official sources. So it can't come from a newspaper necessarily. It has to come from specific health department websites specifically. And then what you would have is either media statements, or you'd have websites or infographics, right? That's how government saw as we released data. And then you're no, that's it's an infographic. It's not machine readable in any way. So what basically happens almost on it every day, every 24 hours, either somebody physically goes and reads one of these and then puts them into our repository as in a CSV file, or this web scraping that happens. So even today, we are now in South Africa over 1 year, 3 weeks since COVID started, we do not have any official open data portal by the government. We are the only one that is thing. So all of it is nice little graphs that you can see and all those things. There's people who work within government who have access to raw data in whichever way, but then they only release these graphs. They don't release the data itself. So that's why this work still continues in a way. So there's also reports. You have stacks of reports in PDF that sit on our health. And what some people do is they go in there, read, and then extract the numbers that might be useful for researchers to kind of use. So then you, for each line, you know where it came from. So everything you can actually figure out the provenance of where that data comes from. So there was then having this, like, at the beginning, explosion of cases. There was, for us, we did no modeling because there was a, Sakema, UJ, UCT, these different universities, they had these capabilities, and we were just trying to make sure that they have data. And also, in saying them having data, also remember that there's data that you can use. This is another thing you learn in working in these spaces. There's data you can use because you're part of a project inside government or inside the private sector, but you can't use publicly, right? So you might want to show a model and things like that. You still use your data, but then you provide a second model that uses public data so that people can actually recreate what you're trying to do. So that's some of the kind of second order, third order effects that we were going for, that people now can share their work and then be able to see that people can actually try and recreate it. Because they might not have access to their data, which comes directly from the health department, and they're under NDAs, which I've had to sign a lot, or they're in these contracts on this part. So I sit on the COVID advisory committee for my province or state. So I had access to some data that I cannot share publicly at all, but then this open one allows us to actually even have discussions like this, right? Instead of me not being able to have a discussion because all of the data is closed up on there. And I will this thing. So it is there. It's called the COVID-19 ZA. It was open by default with a permissive license. Also writing the software in the code is available on there. And there's a lot of contributors, and it's still going on. People are still, like, issues are still being picked up. This week I was fixing a lot of typos because I think we've had an issue with our scraper. So I've been doing it. It's been a while. I think it's more than 4 months since I've done this by hand to actually go and do the daily numbers. But it's been, great to reacquaint myself with the South African COVID numbers on that part. And then to show what can be done, there's a dashboard that shows some of the interesting numbers that you can actually look at through that. And then we've been improving it, adding other features on there. It was very interesting. I won't go on this part when giving some talks to even states or provinces or cities, and they would ask us, hey, do we have data about their city? And you're like, but you are the city and you are in government. You should be able to just get it from. And these are still challenges that we have on this part. And you find that then people come in and they take this data, they put it in for that city, and then that city can also pull it out, and they can use it on that part. And this is because, again, it is not simply, hey, you data is there, data will come out. There's a lot of issues with policy, how practice, and also how people get measured in terms of their performance, right? So people sometimes are very concerned that they might look like they're not doing their job. So don't release data because it might look like we have a very big upswing and we're not doing. So this then reduces the chances that data comes out in specific ways. There was, we have some code that runs the real-time reproduction rate for people who might be interested in having that as part of a pipeline. And then there was also then a model hub, so people can actually, they write their paper and then provide a notebook that can run from their data, any model that is on there. Other than volunteers came in because the data was there now. We had mapping, people who made that available. We had a testing site at the beginning where you could figure out where the testing sites were, and there were translations of this as well. People translated the dashboards into local languages. So this one is Xitsonga, my father's language, on that part. So that's been there. This one is in Chivenda, another language. On there, other, like in this case, Daily Maverick newspaper also fed from it to feed their infographics on there. We then worked a subset to go and collate the first South African integrated health system data set. So because we have this private and public hospital and clinic system, they had data sets that were completely separate, and now we actually put them into one thing. So now if you needed to build something else on top of it, you could actually then take that data, again, all the provenance, you can identify where it came from on there. And then, you could then look at a health systems map across the whole country. The thing that we don't have here, like, for example, bed utilization, but through me being in the province, I knew there was work to now start getting things like bed utilization, especially when we were going through our waves. And from there, you could then get some estimates of how many beds are usable in any facility, like, what kind of facilities are available in that space. So there is a map actually now that you can go and you can actually go through that part. On the other side, we are doing kind of now media monitoring, understanding either newspapers or through social media, what's happened in the last year. So there's a couple of projects that are going on within that space. So probably in the second half of this year, more output in that space is going to start coming out. There was some initial work on there in terms of, hey, can we actually categorize the reactions? Because one of the things that happened, and again, I'm going to try to be open as opposed to think, was this concept of like performative science. Right, so you do science. So there was a lot of like, at the beginning, oh, we're reacting, we're doing things, we're bringing in the scientists. But there's this question of like, is it really what's going on? And at the moment, we're doing some studies to see what's actually happened over time. Like, with the hypothesis that likely there was very high trust of the government at the beginning, and it slowly eroded as we've gone longer and longer and longer into this COVID situation. And now we were trying to, after the fact, figure out why, what happened, kind of in a way, what were the main issues on the reflections and recommendations. We obviously can't do modeling without good data. Public data should be public. It is a big thing. I've given talks now in multiple levels of government about this, of saying like, when you get to a point where you're asking me, who's running an open data project, for data for your district and you don't have it, that something is wrong, right? And that's why you should actually push for things like this, right? And we should also be able to find ways to share this information. Working in silos requires a lot of more energy on that part. So whether we share our data, our approaches, our models on there. And we needed to get ahead of this very early. I think we wouldn't be able to have started this, built this project if we hadn't started it the week after our first case. It would have been so overwhelming. To keep doing this, right? And there's also this question of what is it that we're missing and we're not measuring kind of well. And data is political, right? There's still things today that I've asked for 12 months ago that I still don't have access to, right? I've done the thing of saying, hey, please, let's get access, but still it's a challenge on this part, right? The famous case of the Florida data analyst who was fired because she was refusing to actually change the graphs to look very different, and it happens, right? Public institutions should have policies and procedures to work with those that are outside. I work within the Gauteng Premier's office, so I have agreements through the university with them. You have to sign your NDAs, you have to sign all these other things that are on there, but at least we're trying to give as much advice as we can. Health systems also need better ways to work and share data. There were times I think we had these forms that had to be filled in, and they would be filled in by hand, and people would take pictures and send them, and then somebody else had to sit there and read the picture to actually then classify that this is a patient who's being investigated within these systems. And that's really where we were if we go back like 12, 11 months ago. And we need to be honest about it, as opposed to trying to go like, no, we've been able to. There's a lot of this pandemic has highlighted these things of saying you ultimately then get into these bottlenecks where, oh, how many health professionals do you have who can read medical forms well? That's where it came down to on this part. How do we know how well we can target where we're going to have breakouts before it happens? How we can predict a week or two, a month early where we're going to have hotspots so that we can change non-pharmaceutical interventions. And this is still a hard question to answer just because there's these policy and procedure issues, these behavioral issues that still need to be resolved. For us, what's on the horizon? More work on natural language NLP. As I said, this talk wasn't going to be about that, but you can come to those things. We have this new web translation tool for African languages that should be coming out next week. The GitHub became publicly available this morning. You can actually build it. It's using open models. Yeah, we should survive COVID-19, and I hope all of you survive it as well. And then we all get vaccines, and we will be working to release more data. Thanks for sitting in on this talk. I am willing to chat about lots of different things. And yes, in this case, it takes a village to do this. This is just only for the COVID-19 17 project, you can see how many contributors there have been, and it continues going on, and people adding on things. It'll be sad that one day when I have to say that we're archiving this project and we're stopping, but for for now, it still goes on. So thank you. And I'll be, open to questions. I don't think anything is off bound. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Vukosi. That was wonderful. Thank you for this really wonderful presentation and giving us an insight into your process. This stuff is, I think, often not discussed, but definitely the most important part. So there's several comments and questions that I see in my chat. Some are private, some are public. So I'll try to kind of synthesize some of them. So one is, it's a comment followed by a question, which I'll read out loud. So Amber says, this tweet, this is one of your earlier tweets, and the idea of private sector selling tech as always the automagical solution reminds me of the book, The Technology Fallacy. As an industrial organizational psychologist myself, working in planning, research, and institutional research and effectiveness, I struggle with being pushed to for simple solutions, and now being somewhat labeled as a no person. I just want to preserve enough privacy and quality that the data is actionable and usable and doesn't lead us astray. Suggestions on, do you have suggestions on framing and or communication strategies? I can repeat that if that was.
Yeah, sure. No, I've read it. You tend to read faster than listening, so it's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Amber. It's break it down. Break it down. One of the things that happened about 2 years ago. So South Africa is going through this fourth industrial revolution hysteria, kind of at the moment. There's a journal paper I have to submit next Monday on a critique on this and I was invited to a minister. I'll say this because there's another question about what things am I allowed to say and not say, and how do I keep those two. So I'm going to say this one. It's fine because it's not saying about who specifically was in the room. But I was invited to come speak before our draft report was presented. The draft report for strategy for the fourth industrial revolution was presented to ministers and deputy ministers in the country. And what I did, again, so I didn't go in with flashbang, here's machine learning and all those things. I spent half that presentation breaking down machine learning and AI, you would explain it to your mother or your grandmother. And then, I remember, people raising hands, ministers, deputy ministers, or their assistants going wow, that's the first time somebody's actually said what this machine learning thing is. We've just been being told, hey, we're going into fourth industrial revolution, and you don't want to look stupid. So what you do is say, yes, technology, we're going to solve problems. And through that, the reason I broke that down and I spend time doing that, especially when I'm in public sector, is so that we have a common language, that people understand what it is that you're talking about, that they can then ask the right questions. But once they figure out that there's data that comes in from the other side, they then will go oh, how do you collect that data actually? All right, then but if you don't give them those tools, there's no way they can communicate that. It's automagic. Right, it solves everything, but once you break down the machine and you give those simpler explanations, you then tend to have, I think, more realistic conversations, and you can then say no in a way that they appreciate why you're saying no. But if you don't have that, then it just becomes you are the person who's stopping the progress, right? You're the Luddite, kind of in a way. And I'm no, I live machine learning every day. I'm not that's what I do. I spend 60% of today with students and colleagues doing machine learning. So I'm not that. I'm just saying this might not fit well with with what you're trying
that's an excellent question. I have a follow-up question to that, which I know you and I have talked about this in various times, but improving machine learning, data science literacy for really anyone who has to deal with data in some form is incredibly important. But as you're painfully aware, people in different types of jobs don't necessarily have the time, the incentive, the motivation, the whatever it is to learn it, right? And it's not included as part of people's training when they're getting onboarded for other types of jobs. Do you see a way forward for this, right? I think right now what we have are sort of somewhat patchwork solutions, and I don't know that they'll hold.
Yeah, so I think on that, there's been now more and more policy driven. So if you think about finance, because of, hey, you don't want to discriminate when you're providing credit or whatever, they built in a lot of these things to go in and say, oh, yeah, you should make sure that the people who are working on these things understand the risk or understand the regulatory framework. So you're seeing this through data protection laws, maybe that more and more those things are starting to trickle down to being the person at the bottom should really understand what they're doing, because now there's data protection, and the reason being this is used ultimately for machine learning or something like that. But this will take a much longer time. So in South Africa, we're seeing a couple of places now where policies are starting to show up on how government should use data, right? But then this is not enough, because again, the policy is nice, it's written, but then it's not, the practical implementation is going to be a completely different thing. And that's where, for example, when I give advice in that part, I say, like, you have to get to a point where the lowest worker in the public service, like, understands this. And that should be your goal, and figure that out, right? But that's the hard thing. It's not the simple, that is the hard thing to do. It is not writing the policy. It is going to be when they kind of, a person is sitting, whatever, in the US, the DMV, or for us in the traffic department, and they go in and say, hey, we take this data actually gets stored like this, and we have these policies. If they can say that person who's in the coalface, then I'll be like, yeah, I think they've done it. It's not the minister, it's not the governor or the premier saying that. That doesn't make, for me, it won't give me that solace that they've done that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Very good. So there was another question. It's a private question that I'll kind of rephrase a little bit to add my own question to it as well. So this person asks, the sort of monetary incentives that you mentioned, like grants, and also other incentives like prestige or good PR and things like that, it seems to have driven a substantial portion of COVID research, as you mentioned, right? Both in the continent and also here in the US. This person asks, does this extend to other parts of the tech space as well? And a question I'll add to this is, it seems to me like these types of incentives, which I agree are probably playing a big role, are not necessarily the best way to do good science, right? Some of the best science is not necessarily like the flashiest thing. And so how do you sort of balance that, especially in settings where these questions are a matter of life or death, right? Whether it's happening, tomorrow or a year from now, it actually is sort of substantial. How do you think through that?
Sure. And also adding Yim's question about how do I manage between what I have in public and private data. And this one will be private and public experiences. At the moment, I would be screaming, because there were a lot of instances where but I can't speak about what the instance was when I was screaming. But the thing I want to highlight in this case is, yes, it is. So in this case, if you're a young researcher, get to know how your science gets funded wherever you are in the world. This is very important, because you're going to get to these points where you see some weird line in a grant prospectus that says, yeah, and you should have nanobots. And then you have to understand what actually happened to that, them saying there should be nanobots. And you find this, like in developing countries, it's also very complex, because then it's international funding agencies. And it might just be that country Y, wherever, thinks that AI is the best thing that can save Africa. And as such, we're going to provide a couple of $1 million, and we're going to give it to a government, and they provide a new grant. But it must have AI in it. On that part. But as a local who works in the space, you're like, but the data infrastructure is really bad. That's the thing that's required here. It is not the AI. Why not fix that? And these are the really these tensions that you see in these spaces. And one of the things sometimes of taking time, again, I'm going to say this, if you are a scientist, you must be in the public, and you must also be interacting with the political side of this space, is to offer that advice, offer that explaining, being patient in that explaining of why, hey, this might be short-sighted, and how somebody in that position should push back and say, maybe let's add a line that we should also do data preparation or something inside. It is not an easy thing. And yes, COVID just was the latest thing on that part. If you've seen, I think there's probably a lot of interesting work in critique, probably in the ICT4D society for the last 20 years. and seeing how that has actually progressed over time. Just looks at these when you put incentives and then it changes what people actually then say, we're doing research in this on that part. Because at the same time, yes, I have to look at, I would like to have my students, I would like to have my group, and we need to make sure that we've got funding that is coming in. And it's hard, right, to say no, right? Because then even the university puts and says, but are you bringing in money for you get evaluated as as a faculty member on how much money you're bringing in. So these things then just keep on cascading. And sometimes, yes, they end up looking very stupid, but yeah, it's on there. I think just to finish on that point, on the private and public, yeah, I tend to I spend time obviously putting together the slides, so they kind of guide my thinking in terms of what I'm not going to I'm not going to touch when I speak. I once was in a talk by Rajiv Ghani, who's also was Obama's data scientist for the first, I think, and the second running on the top, yeah. And he tends to do that. If there's something that then has to be completely, it's like, that's the thing that's not recorded and we speak on a table or something. Like, I think I tend to take that if you want that private conversation about something, because there is still insight, because you have to, again, balance between, is this something worthwhile to teach because somebody's about to go into this situation, and them getting that understanding is worthwhile, and it's a public good more likely than not. On that, but that would not be in this forum, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you so much. A question that just came in from Nasir says, how do we really make governments to embrace and make decisions based on data and information? That's how we get impact to scale, by influencing policies that matter. Yeah, maybe you can also even say if you agree with that first, and then yeah.
Yeah, I'll answer that and also try to go to Francis' question. I would have in the past said look at health, because if in South Africa, I think this is because if you looked at HIV, if you looked at TB, you see how a concentrated amount of money, time, and skill has gone on to really change the way we really treat, the way we understand the system, and it's very much data driven. But at the same time, you can see that one singular focus also didn't take care of some of the basics within the health information systems, that when COVID hit, it's kind of then became kind of a mess because the systems weren't built to now track the things that are important for COVID that are different for TB and different for HIV, right? So, but you can see when it actually got embraced, these things actually kind of worked. And it's a time thing. You build your community around this. You build a people who work in these spaces and become very good. And through time, you build the trust. And that's a big thing. People have to trust that you're on the same team and things I make the joke about PowerPoint sometimes, because I found that when you go into these spaces, it becomes antagonistic because you're here looking for money. You're not here really caring about the problem. Right, because and that's the thing, is that you have to build trust to saying we're in this together. We're looking at COVID together. We're looking at education together, and let's see how far we can go on that thing. Francis asked about low resource countries. Yeah, sure. We've had 10 years ago, you had a lot more open systems. Now, through different issues with privacy and also encryption, things are changing. But if you look at the Masakane project and the AI for D language challenges, there's a lot of work that's been going on finding alternative ways to get data, and also more activist ways of getting data on that part. Just because we are at this point for language, I think we have a few years left. I'm sorry to be if basically a machine doesn't understand that language, a decade from now, it would be like that language never existed, right? Because the internet is becoming so monolingual. And this is becoming very scary. So there's a lot of work that a lot of people are doing in this space to try and do it now. And some of it is activist, in that you might not follow all the rules, and not in breaking people's privacy specifically. And there's a lot of work, especially in IP gray areas, on how to get data on the internet. Yeah.
That is that is, I felt what you just said, right? Because, I, for a while when the internet was really bad at Amharic, I mean, it still is. I thought that's good. I don't really know that I want the internet to be better in Amharic, but you're right that because of that, there's certain things that I would have used it in Amharic that I don't, right? Because it doesn't do a very good job. And that might lead to the internet becoming more monolingual and societies becoming more monolingual. We're on online all the time. So yeah, how do you think through that? Have you just made your peace with it, or do you see an opportunity here to slow that down?
We're definitely fighting. Like, I think that's the whole premise of the Masakane project, right? Is bring all your fighters, as many of them as possible, like literally train people, arm them, and then get as much of that as now as possible. And then that's what I think the energy within that project has been. That it's been fascinating seeing what people can do. People are spending weekends with the elderly, transcribing stories in their languages and making them digital and making them available. Just because this, like, for me, I was never a person who's like, oh, for digital preservation or whatever. I was like, oh, I'm interested in machine learning. I'm interested in natural language processing. Let's do this stuff. But then you're like, oh, I want to do this task for a language here in South Africa. And then you find how hard it is to do. And then you really push, to actually get that done. Yeah. So it is, and ideas are welcome. And also, I think also this fight is also very interesting because it's actually creating a new kind of batch of researchers who are working very differently, maybe from the West.
Yeah, that's really excellent. Thank you for thank you for the fight. I appreciate that. Something that you mentioned sort of in passing, I know you and I have talked about this quite a bit, and it's of interest to many people in the data economies group. I see many people here. It's related to data access and data sharing, right? Yeah. Which we've discussed. As you said, data on the continent is sometimes really not accessible, completely shut off, and other times it's just accessible to people and institutions that it shouldn't necessarily be accessible to. And I would love to hear, I'd love for everyone else, I guess, to hear your perspective on what role policies can play here, what role like education, literacy, awareness can play here, what you see is the future, what you hope is the future, but what you think it will be the actual future. Really, any thoughts that you have here would be very enlightening to everyone.
Yeah, so South Africa, again, using a local example, they've gone in, and especially research that is funded by the government, to say data during your PhD, postdoc, masters, as much of it as possible should be now start being put inside institutional repositories and hopefully on permissive licenses, right? That it's actually made. But at the same time, there's this tension that the government is also pushing for more IP protections, which is very odd. Like, once obviously the people who are looking at both of those policies have these tensions that they have to live through on that part. So we'll see. But that I'm starting to notice, for example, our library keeps on sending us emails saying, hey, make sure your students put data out on the institution repository so that at least, the government money is making sure that that data is open. But at the same time, sometimes you have these odd situations where you might have funding that comes from outside, and then from there, the data is owned by somebody else who's not even in that country. And this is a challenge, again, which brings up having that discussion of, hey, we really should understand what happens when these type of policies are put together. How can you have data that comes from from Botswana, mostly being, again, this is not a real example. I'm not saying that, mostly being only in France, and then French researchers have access to it, but not Botswanan researchers. And then this happens. This definitely does happen in those instances. You need to think through that. And again, this is where the scientist, as in the public, and understanding the politics is important. I'm a person who doesn't shy away from being in those uncomfortable spaces. You have to, because if you're not one, also the other side of this coin is that the public also loses faith in science, right? Because they don't see you being out there and actually pushing through that. There was a question here about integrity in research if restrictions are placed on you. Yeah, do the right thing, even though it hurts. The scars are there. I think a lot of people who've either worked with me closely and things like that, you get to know the people who've had the scars because we start sharing the stories and things like that. But you have to do it, because what happens is that if you don't, then you build your things really on a house of cards. It's easy for it to fall apart. And again, you break that trust. And if you break that trust, it sometimes might be hard for it to be regained. I use the example especially about machine learning in education. I've been very wary sometimes. I have a PhD student now two PhD students are working on it. I was saying like, don't overpromise in this space because people are looking for solutions here. So if you end up coming and you're failing, you can break trust that stops any of us from working in this space for the next 20 years or 30 years on that. So like, be very careful. So be open, be clear, and really be truthful as you're in the process. Don't say, yeah, we're going to have now every student now having personalized education from next week. That is very dangerous.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. So we still have a few minutes. I know some folks may want to just jump in. So if you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to unmute and ask your questions. And we're also monitoring the chat on the YouTube if anyone is watching the live stream. So feel free to drop your questions there. And I'm also monitoring the chat, the chats here. Yeah.
Cool. I think Olivia is asking about interpretation of data support a certain worldview. As I said, which I should just make. I normally make my presentations public anyway. There's a nice article from the New Yorker. I think that's worthwhile. It talks about this, like, what happens where, like, with data, that it can be misleading and you can mislead with it. That's why normally in our data science classes as well, we tend to teach about visualization and how you can lie with visualization. On that specific, again, helping in part of the broader ethics of that space of saying, like, be careful of what your data says and what it might mean, but then also make sure that the people who are reading your data are as informed as possible. Going back to the COVID project, one of the things we did is we provided a graph that shows the number of cases per province or state divided by the estimated population in that space. And I remember, like, the day we released that graph, getting emails of people complaining because it showed one state as being worse than the others. Right. And then for them, like, I'm guessing they were worried that now in that space, people were going to say, oh, we're worse off, kind of in a space. So we're like, no, we haven't done anything. Yes, it's a view, but then we give you all the views. So we ended up putting on our dashboard, there's a link to a very nice discussion on how you can read COVID numbers and also what they say and what they don't say. Just so that we can actually inform people, right? Instead of just say, because those things, and then also our statistics office, so from the Statistics General Office, then they, as soon as they came up with the new estimates of the populations per province, I remember getting an email out of the blue. I didn't even know that they were reading the dashboard saying, please change your population estimates and use these ones attached, kind of in a way, just so that, again, that people get on that part. The pattern in that data hasn't changed, which has been very funny, like, because but people do get really touched by specific things when it comes to data.
Yeah, and thanks for the additional slides too. Any other thoughts or questions? Does anyone want to jump in with their questions? Excellent. Okay, so maybe we can wrap up. Thank you so much, Vukosi. This was really incredible, and I know you've had a very packed stretch, so we really appreciate you making time and all that you do for data science community in the African continent, but also elsewhere. So thank you so much. And we will send out announcements about the final speaker in May, a very exciting talk by Maria Rodriguez on social work and data science and artificial intelligence. So stay tuned and thank you very much.
Yeah, and thanks everybody. And it's great seeing, I know I can't say directly hi to a lot of familiar faces. I'll probably say something on WhatsApp. Thanks everyone.
Thank you very